I'm Esther Stapleton-Stone, and this is In the Boardroom. And my guest today is the Venerable Dr. Reverend Sue Weller. And Sue is an Archdeacon and an Archdeacon Missioner in the Diocese of Lichfield. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you, Esther. Lovely to be with you today.
Oh, I'm really excited about our conversation, and I'm sure the people that are listening and tuning in or viewing from YouTube will take away some spicy nuggets.
I hope so.
Yes, I'm sure. So, Sue, please share with us where you grew up.
Esther, I was born in East Yorkshire, born in the town of Beverley, just outside Kingston upon Hull. Very beautiful place in the country. Not many people go unless they're passing through to go to the ferry, to go to the continent, but it's there.
Oh, so I did have a little look on the map, as you do. And I was like, oh, it's got surrounded by lots of greenery, lovely fields.
It is, yeah. Beverley itself has Beverley Minster, which is one of the largest churches in the country, a bit of a hidden secret. There's Beverley Racecourse is there, so any racing fans may have seen Beverley Racecourse on the TV. And then easy access to the coast. So we used to have holidays along the coast, and sort of fired some of my love for wildlife and animals and plants and the like.
Oh, lovely. So looking back, what did you like about growing up there?
We had family close by, both sides of the family, quite a few around there. And just that opportunity when we weren't at school to go out to the coast and explore, and yeah, beautiful place to live.
Yeah, because most people live inland a lot, so going to the coast is often a real treat and seeing the sea. So that's a real gift, isn't it, to grow up?
Yeah. Now living in Lichfield, I do miss the sea. About as far away as we can be.
Yeah, that's the thing. So where did you go to university and what did you study?
I went to university first of all in Leeds University, and studied a degree in botany and zoology. So anything plants and animals. They don't do it anymore because it was two-thirds of a degree stuffed together, which they decided a few years after me that it was too much. But yeah, first degree was at Leeds University.
And so did you go on to study anything else at university?
When I'd finished the first degree, I was offered some research staying in Leeds, or given the opportunity to move somewhere else. And everybody I'd been at Leeds with was moving on, so I thought, take the opportunity to go somewhere else. So I accepted the research based initially at Manchester University, looking at pollution, and specifically metal pollution in the marine environment. So working with paint on shipping that stops things like barnacles and seaweed and the like growing. So it was with a laboratory in Plymouth. So I was constantly driving up and down the country, doing research in Manchester and Plymouth. And then my supervisor decided to get a job with Liverpool University, and they have had a marine station on the Isle of Man. So I was now doing the Isle of Man and Plymouth rather than Manchester and Plymouth. So we'd regularly drive up and down the country to do field work and sampling and testing, etc. So it was an interesting time of trying to do a degree in two places at the same time.
Wow. So what skills then did you learn while you was going up and down the country?
I think it was one of the key skills really was organisation, of trying to be in the right place at the right time. I mean, the work I was doing meant that the tide had to be out. I didn't do scuba diving to get the samples. So I had to get the timing right, because the tides in the southwest of England range hugely by many meters depending on what period in the month you go. So it was making sure that any experiments, any sampling, any work was based around timetables, so you could be in the right place at the right time. Although on one occasion I was rescued by the Royal Marines. I went down onto the shore, and it was following all the times in the tide timetables, and the pressure, air pressure that day meant that the tide changed incredibly quickly, and I was stranded at the bottom of a cliff with Ministry of Defence firing range above me. So I had to. There was a telephone at the bottom of the cliff. This is the day before mobile phones. Rang up and they said, all right, we'll send somebody down. And there were 3 Marines abseiling down the cliff behind me and rescued me from the beach. So
wow.
it was all right.
Gosh, so that must have been quite exciting.
Yeah, those were the days where you were allowed to go and do field work on your own. I'm not sure it would happen these days, but so they decided that I'd stopped their firing practice, so they weren't even going to help. I was carrying 4-litre bottles of water and stuff. But no, just get her off the beach.
Oh, so did you ever go back to complete the research there? Or
oh yeah, I did that regularly. I was on the same beaches every 2 months.
So you became a regular, and they kind of knew you were there.
Yeah, they did. I mean, I always tried to go. It didn't always work, but I tried to go when the firing range wasn't in use, because they put all the flags up when the firing range isn't in use. But it just depended on the tides. So it wasn't, it was dictated by the tides rather than the firing range. It never happened again. So,
but it does happen, though, doesn't it? It does. It does happen. I've heard of people.
Just because something's set, it doesn't mean to say it's going to happen. The tides can change very quickly.
Yeah. I've heard of that happening to people before and being stranded, and it's quite scary, actually.
It is. Yeah, when you look around you and all you're surrounded by is, a sheer cliff face, and there's firing above you and water in front of you. Yeah, what do we do now?
You learnt skills then.
I did.
Oh, brilliant. So can you share your career journey, and how has your faith been central in it?
When I'd finished the research and done the doctorate, then I was offered a job at the laboratory where I was studying in Plymouth, and for that one it was looking at metal again, but not in the sea. It was in the rivers, because there are a lot of closed mines in the southwest of England, some of which they're now exploring for some of the metal reserves that we need in today. So worked with them, but at the same time I was part of the main church, St Andrew's in Plymouth, and was starting to help lead some of the groups where people were exploring about what Christianity is all about. So doing both things at the same time. And I increasingly felt that God was asking me to choose between one or the other. And in the end, 3 people separately on the same day came along and said, we think God's calling you to be ordained, to be a vicar. Have you ever thought about it? And I sort of sat around for a few months, and then eventually went to see my vicar, who sat there as if to say, where have you been? And then went through a selection process and was accepted for training. So I went off to university yet again. And it was always there. I mean, as a scientist, I've never seen any conflict between science and faith. I was trying to understand and trying to explain what was there in front of me. So, and science is that, really, trying to explain and understand. So it didn't feel as though I was sort of leaving all that behind, but felt as though it was one end of the spectrum was looking at the pollution caused by our lack of care for creation, and then going into the church was more coming at it from the other end of what is faith about, what's it based on, and when we put God first, then we look at creation in a different way.
That's so good. And so your input into leading people into these courses, I suppose they probably looked at you thinking, oh, this is a scientist, and wouldn't she think differently? So did you think your profession helped when you were leading these courses?
I think it did. I think the sort of knowing that you can come at faith with different backgrounds and from different angles, I think helped. And then also, a bit like we've just said, really, the way in which faith feeds into whatever role you're in, and science being one of them. So, yeah, I think it probably did.
Brilliant. Yeah. So how was studying theology different from all your other degrees?
I think when I did the theology degree, I knew I was doing it for a specific role, rather than doing it for a degree in itself that might lead to a career using that degree. You know, when you start training, you're not, it's not rock solid that you will be ordained at the end of it. But I approached the degree in that way, that I approached it from the point of view of how can I use it. So trying when I was in lectures or discussion groups, etc., of trying to think at it a little bit more from that angle rather than it being a purely academic degree.
Brilliant.
And trying to apply it as I was going along.
Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah.
So going back now into your industry,
Yep.
So what were the challenges of being a woman in the science industry?
When I was a scientist, there was certainly a glass ceiling for women. There were no senior scientists who were female in the laboratory role where I worked. And there was resistance to any of that promotion. But I think also that something that might have fed into that was, and is still the case today, is trying to get funding to do research means that often if you spend a lot of time doing bids for funding, you don't spend the time doing the research that took you into the career in the first place. And I think for some there was that sense of, I don't want to be in a more senior position because I want to be doing the research and not spending my time pushing bits of paper and trying to get funding. So I think that was part of it, but there was certainly a glass ceiling for women at that stage to be senior scientists in the laboratory.
So do you feel the same way about being in ministry, or does it feel different?
The experience I've had is that I've probably had more opposition as a female scientist than I've had within the church. I know that's not the same
That's
for all
refreshing
women.
to hear, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? Over the years, it is, isn't it? Over the years, it's not been the same for everybody.
Yeah.
And and there are still pockets where there's opposition. My experience in the church has been that it's when people experience a woman in ministry that they then just seeing it in practice makes a huge difference. Sometimes, and I had one conversation where it was said, well, oh, we don't want a woman, but will you come be our vicar? And the lady who preached at my service when I first became Archdeacon was asked that. And it's, on the surface, you think, how does that work? But when you think about it, it's because they've not seen anybody do that before, who's a woman standing at the front. Whereas over time, that's changed. And we've now got women bishops as well as women priests. So things have changed over the years. And it's that, for me, it's that opportunity to show what God's equipped you to do, and then often people will change their mind.
Wonderful, wonderful. So firstly, please can you share what the role of an archdeacon entails?
Well, an archdeacon works with the bishop, and it works with parishes usually in a defined geographical area. I was Archdeacon of Walsall in the Diocese of Lichfield, and I'm now the Archdeacon of Lichfield in the Diocese of Lichfield. So I now cover Lichfield, Penkridge, Rugeley and Tamworth, and the churches in those areas. What we do can be anything and everything. So from leading services and preaching, anything to do with buildings, so helping parishes if they need permission to do work on buildings, including things like, if they need a new kitchen or toilets or something like that. Legal queries about weddings, funerals, churchyards, all those kind of things. Vacancies, I'm going through the whole appointments process. Finance. And then the legal side of licensing people into new roles within the church, whether it's church wardens or raw deans or clergy. working with chaplains. We've got a lot of prisons in this diocese, particularly off the M54, in the Concrete area. Pastoral care, prayer, annual retreats, links to churches overseas as well. We've got a number of mission links with churches overseas. So in a way, you name it, you'll probably do some of it at some point. I had inquiries about a wedding this morning, and working on a service, having come to the end of a vacancy process to license somebody tomorrow. So it's it changes every day. There's no one day that's the same as another.
So that's a great career to be in, because every day is different, and you've got so many different skills to apply at different times, and so that variation is just amazing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, that's so good. So have you ever done mission work abroad?
I was based in Brazil for 6 years. So it was, but through the Church of England, and working with my family, and we had people from all over the world, loads of different nationalities, with English being the common denominator rather than particular views on particular things when it comes to faith in Christ, which in itself was really good, because it helped people to have discussions and debates with each other, and you got many different angles. Downside was a lot of them were working with some of the big multinationals like Shell and BP, so they could be asked to move with their families at very short notice, and you'd build up friendships and things, and they'd be off to another part of the world. But there was a sort of core group of Brazilians, often who'd married somebody from the UK, and stayed there with that sort of ongoing core. As I say, that sort of core group that was still there all the time that we were there. But it was a really interesting, tough place to work. Bureaucracy was a nightmare, and saw the way that God works in some of the poorest people in the world who were so committed to Christ, and then some of the wealthiest people in the world who often really struggled, even though on the outside it looked as though they had everything. It's a really fascinating time.
Brilliant. So how did working abroad in mission, how did you relate it now to mission, your mission position in this country?
I think it showed how you can share faith with anybody and everybody, no matter what their position is in society, or opportunities they have or haven't had. And in most cases, people will talk about it if they're given the opportunity. And I've never had anybody, for example, who's talked to me and is struggling, and I say, would you like me to pray for you? I've never had anybody say no. Some have said no, and you say, could I pray with you? But just to know that God's there and He's not out to get them, I think for many people is a real starting point that helps them move on in their faith. And you can do that anywhere with anybody, as much in this country as you could overseas.
So how has your faith helped in time of uncertainty, especially during your crisis management during the COVID times?
Knowing that Christ is always with us, I think is the foundation of that, through the Holy Spirit. And during COVID, it was just as I was moving post to be Archdeacon of Lichfield, and the bishop asked me to take the lead on COVID for the diocese, saying, there'll be just a few things to read. 2 years later. So right through COVID, I was just dealing with inquiries and paperwork all the time, but it brought back those skills that I'd used or built up as a scientist, and we were doing all sorts, sort of dealing with hospitals, crematoriums, local council, schools, government, local government, if the crisis management, if there were major deaths, for example, and put all that in place. Thankfully, the vast majority of it we didn't need to use, but it needed to be there. And then trying to work out as different guidance came out of how they worked with each other, because sometimes they didn't, and having to go back to government on some of those, and then explaining at a local level how to actually put things into practice. So it certainly wasn't any quieter for me in COVID than it was at any other time, but it was interesting how it brought quite a bit of that science background to the fore, to be used in those conversations and working out what to do and when to do it and when not to do it.
So what are the benefits of having business industry experience in your role as Archdeacon Missioner for the Diocese of Lichfield?
I think having worked as a scientist, I know the pressures and joys of another role that's not within the church. And I think also being in a role where there are often more Christians than people might think there are. And I think sometimes people feel quite isolated in their faith, and it's not always the case that there aren't others around. And sometimes being a little bit more open about our faith, we can, as people said, once they knew I was going for training, quite a few Christians appeared out of the woodwork, as it were, in the laboratory. So I didn't feel as though I was leaving them without anybody, there. But I hadn't really got to know them in that way while I was there. So it was, that was a shame that we hadn't had that opportunity when we were together. I think, as I mentioned earlier, for me, it's two extremes of the same spectrum of looking at pollution and looking at what God has given us and how we look after creation. And even today, as we sit, we've got pouring rain outside, and I've been on the lunchtime news about the climate change and the resulting changes in weather and the way we treat the planet. So it links in at both ends, and I can see how those come together. And people seem to appreciate it when I talk about life in a white lab coat as opposed to life with a white collar around my neck. Makes those links.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because you've got two important roles there, still looking after God's creation, the environment, and you're looking after the humans that God's created. So you're doing both. You've looked at both. So that's such a novel position to experience. Wonderful.
And I think now in the church, we've got eco church, we've got eco school. We're really thinking hard when people are changing things in their churches, whether it's the boiler or should we put solar panels on, etc. That thinking at it from that point of view of faith, of why we're doing it, not just that it's good for us, it'll be cheaper, and it's good for our generation and maybe the next, but that it's actually much deeper than that as well. And it's because of our faith in God that we want to use the resources in the way that we're called to, and not abuse them and make things worse just for because it's easier. Some of these things are not the easy option or necessarily the cheapest option, but to actually think it through as to why, and put faith into practice in that way.
Brilliant. So what advice have you got for someone considering a career move that's been in industry for a long time?
I think we've all got gifts and abilities, and we can use those gifts and abilities in different ways. I think being open to the possibility that there may be another career out there that you'd be really suited for. Being willing perhaps to study and learn again. When I studied theology, it meant that in total I'd been at university for 9 years. People couldn't really understand, having done a first degree and a doctorate, that, oh no, she's going to university again, how does this work? And there are many different ways of studying and learning, obviously, and that's just one of them. But being open to doing that, being open to growing into new skills as well as using ones that you've already got. I think knowing, for me as a Christian, it's knowing nothing is ever wasted. And for me, it was obvious during COVID of the example I've given of using some of the skills that I had as a scientist. But I think even if it's not always obvious, what we've learned and what we've experienced is used in whatever field that we're in. I think also today it's more usual to change careers. For me, it's 30 years ago that I went to do theology, and at that stage, really, for many people at that time, it was if you choose a career, that's your career for life. Whereas I think now especially with so many different forms of technology, there's an openness to look at different things and to use different skills. So I think being that sense of you have skills, you have abilities, being open and willing to look at other things and how those might be used, and not necessarily just focusing on the field that you're in, even if you've been in it for many years.
And it's never too late to try something new, No. And sometimes people think, well, they've reached a certain age, they're redundant and they've got no use, but there's so many transferable skills with the wealth of experience that people have got. So to anyone listening out there, if you've got a wealth of experience and you think, oh, you're kind of cornered, I think just reflect on what you've done in the past and just see how those skills can be used in a different way. And it'd be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it would.
Life-changing, hopefully.
It could be.
So if someone listening or viewing this podcast aspires to be a leader or a leadership member on a board, what are the skills to develop?
I'm part of many meetings, as you can probably imagine, including being a board member. And I think the importance of knowing the background of what's being talked about, not necessarily knowing all the details, because we can't always do that and we're not always privy to that before meetings. But knowing some of the background, being a good listener is a prime skill I would suggest to develop. And then also having insightful questions to really think about what could be asked that would actually help to move things forward. And being willing also to have the courage sometimes to offer suggestions and ideas for development. In the early days, when I first became an archdeacon and was a member of the bishop's staff, everybody else had been there, before me. I was the first female priest as an archdeacon on there, so it's a bit overwhelming and a very steep learning curve when you start. And I think that's particularly where the listening comes in, and actually really getting to know how the structure works and what the different ideas and different angles are, but then having that courage to go with your own convictions and be part of those discussions, and not to sit back too long, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And I think having that as well, not just for sort of aiming for a board meeting, but whether it's in one-to-one conversations or small group conversations or whatever it is, you can develop those in all different environments and then apply them in more of a leadership role, but not waiting until you get to that point and then try and develop those skills, but do those on the way through to build them up. So by the time you get there, then you've got that skill set.
I love that. That is so important, because people think they've got to wait until they're actually in that position. And sometimes that's a bit too late, isn't it? Because you need to kind of develop sometimes a bit of an armor as well. So you're not so self-conscious about speaking up or having a voice. And sometimes women are afraid to use their voices, especially in a male-dominated environment. But I think just practicing and with a friend, it could be just a small thing, and a bit of role playing, and you can kind of develop those skills. So when the time arises, you might be a bit scared inside, but you've developed incrementally, step by step, those skill levels for when the time is right. It's a bit like growing fruit. You just don't have the fruit appear, do you? You have to water it.
No, it takes time.
All those kind of things. And I think we've got to look at our skill base in that kind of way. Keep nourishing it. keep growing it gradually. And when the time arises, and sometimes it's when God opens doors for us, know when the doors
Yes.
open, and not being afraid to walk through.
I think accepting that we've all got different skills and abilities as well. It's not just because you can't do something doesn't mean to say there won't be somebody else in the group who can, or the other way around. Don't expect things necessarily of yourself that others have got skills. And I think some of the work that we've done as a team of looking at each other's strengths and actually understanding, for example, why somebody might ask a lot of questions.
Yes.
Because they're a very detailed, that's the way they think, whereas other people might be more of the big picture scattergun effect. And sometimes those sort of understanding of the way people work, not necessarily personalities, can go beyond personality, but those different ways of working can actually really help a team work better together, because you're not thinking they're just asking me lots of questions because they think I don't know the answer. It's rather that they're asking lots of questions because they want to know the detail, or somebody else might be quite happy with the general picture. So thinking through those different ways of thinking is another real skill for working as a group.
Love that. So what are your hopes for the future in terms of your missional work?
I try and, as a Christian, I try and approach everything that I do from that point of view. Whether it's talking about a new kitchen in a church, why do they want it? What's their aim? Not just so they can make a cup of tea or something, but what's the bigger picture? What's the vision that they've got for opening up that church in a more to increase their hospitality to the local community and the people that they serve? So it's thinking beyond the practical often, and the reasons why. And I think asking that question in itself, why people do things. Sometimes things can happen for years, and the original reason why it started has been lost in the midst of time. And asking, why have a group for young mums and carers? What are you hoping to do? You provide the fellowship, you provide the friendship, but also provide the opportunity to get to know what faith in Christ is all about. And sometimes when people are so busy, they focus on the practical, but forget about the spiritual background to why we do things. So I think sometimes it's not always doing something new. It can be doing something that has happened for a while, but differently, and actually make that real missional difference. And I think, like I said at the beginning, really, of helping people to know that God's not out there to get them. He loves it. He loves us all equally, but doesn't force himself into our lives. But if people don't know, then they can't choose, can't allow themselves to get to know God better. So it's giving people those opportunities, and in whatever way, and showing that love that we have for Christ to others in a way that attracts rather than pushes people away. So working on unity, working if there are problems and conflicts, sorting those out, and reminding people why and what they're there for.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, well, we've come to the end of our conversation, and I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, Sue. And I've learned a lot from listening to you, and I'm sure people have benefited from our conversation as well. All those scientists out there that have got a faith, step out, represent.
Yeah.
And it just shows that it is possible, and to have a faith and to have a science background too. So I'm Esther Stapleton-Stone, and I've been in conversation with the Venerable Dr. Reverend Sue Weller. So thank you for sharing your story, and we really look forward to what the future holds for you, Sue.
Thank you, Esther.